May it please the court, Judge Netburn, counsel, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. When John and Damaris Simmons went to sleep on May 26, 2007, they had no idea that the day that was about to unfold would be the worst day of their lives. They had no idea that the next day would be a day that they would hope that they would be able to forget. They had no idea that that day would come, and that day would take from them the most precious gift that they ever had. The most precious gift that they ever had was their little girl, an 8-year-old girl by the name of Taylor Simmons. Taylor died that day. John Simmons had no idea, Damaris Simmons had no idea that a truck driver would drive down a road and that he would be careless, that he would be negligent. And they had no idea that the city of New York would not just be careless and negligent, but that they would be reckless in their conduct, not in so much what they did, but in what they didn't do as well, that took the life of a beautiful 8-year-old child. And I will tell you right now, it has ruined the life of those parents. So what I'd like to do right now is to take you back in time so that I can introduce you to John and Damaris Simmons, the couple seated back here in the back of the courtroom. John and Damaris grew up in Brooklyn. They didn't have much growing up, but the one thing that they did have was they each had a strong work ethic. Damaris Simmons started working when she was a teenager, working at fast food restaurants, Wendy's, McDonald's. Eventually, she got a job at the Brooklyn DA's office where she worked as a file clerk, eventually rising through the ranks to become a senior file clerk. And after a number of years of doing that, she applied for a position with the New York Police Department, where she became a member of the police department only 2 months before this accident happened. John Simmons himself also had a strong work ethic, and he too was an officer, but a different kind of officer. He worked right here at 60 Center Street, working as a court officer at first, and then working up the ranks to a senior court officer. Eventually, he took a test to become a court clerk, and he was the court clerk to Judge Martin Schoenfeld, a judge who sits right here in 60 Center Street. In 1997, Damaris and John got married, and 2 years later, they had a beautiful little girl. That little girl was their only child, Taylor Simmons. And I will tell you right now, these parents did everything they could for her. They took her to the museums, they took her to the movies, they took her to Coney Island, to the beach. John, who was a Mets fan, well, I guess Taylor had no choice but to become a Mets fan. He played with her all the time, he played catch with her. She actually used to sleep with a baseball glove in the bed. Well, as of the day of the accident, Taylor Simmons was in 2nd grade. And every day, John would take her to school, or Damaris would take her to school, but because Damaris was a rookie cop, she was working these ungodly hours, working from 8 at night till 4 in the morning. She wasn't going to get up to take Taylor, but John sure was. So he'd take her and he'd drive her to school. The accident that took Taylor's life happened only a block away from where they live, less than 1,000 feet from their home. John and Damaris had bought a home on 220th Street in Queens. The intersection where this accident happened, Springfield Boulevard and 90th, right around the block. For you to understand how this accident happened and why this accident happened, I've got to tell you a little bit about the intersection itself. 90th Avenue is a small street, only about 30 feet wide, 1 lane in each direction running east and west. That's the road that John would take to drive his daughter to school. But Springfield Boulevard, on the other hand, was a major intersection. 6 lanes, 3 in each direction. And the one thing that happened before this accident ever took place is this. Years before, more than 5 years before, there were accidents upon accidents happening at that intersection. And the city of New York undertook to do traffic studies, and they did do traffic studies. And they found that the traffic control devices that were there were not serving their purpose. Stop signs were there, and they didn't work. So after conducting their studies, they decided they better put up a traffic light. And they had the head of the signalization department, someone who we've questioned under oath at something known as a deposition before this trial ever started. Her name, Rena Gelman, and she's the one who signed off on putting up a traffic light. And that light was installed 2 years before the date of this accident. When Rena Gelman signed off, there were things that were not done. And one of the things that was not done was this. It turns out that there was a form a work order designed to allow that traffic light to be installed, but it said at the bottom, is there anything blocking the traffic light? Trees, do they have to be cut? Foliage, does it have to be cut? It was all left blank. There was nothing done. So that if you were driving southbound, you would see a large tree, a tree that was actually blocking the traffic light, rather, so that you couldn't even see it. But what happened was this. Any time a traffic light is installed in New York City, it has to be installed pursuant to a statute, something that you'll hear about called the Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And with a 6-lane roadway, the minimum safety standards mean that you have to install at least 2 lights, not just 1, 2. Now, there was 1 light off to the left, but directly in front of a driver heading southbound, you would not be able to see that light. You would only see a tree directly in front of you. Well, after that light was installed, 2 years before this accident happened, accidents kept happening. And there was a neighbor, a man who lived around the block, a former New York City detective, who actually saw that there were accidents happening. And he looked and he saw this tree right in front of the light, and he tried to do something about it. So what he did was, he went to the local precinct, to the 105th precinct, and said, you've got a problem. There's a traffic light behind a tree. No one can see it. Thank you, sir. We'll take care of that. That was the response. No one took care of it. He then went to the Parks Department, because he knew, as a detective from New York City, they were the ones who chopped down the trees or trimmed the foliage. They said, sir, you have to go to the Department of Transportation. We need a work order in order to cut trees. So he went to the Department of Transportation, and once again he was told, thank you, sir. We appreciate your input. I can assure you all of that fell on deaf ears. So no one from the city did anything, and this traffic light was behind a tree. So let's go to the day of the accident. John Simmond is going to be taking his daughter Taylor to school. He wakes her up at 6 o'clock in the morning, goes through this little ritual where he gives her a little kiss, shakes her, time to get up, Taylor. Does it again about 5 minutes later, and again. Sure enough, he takes the blankets down, and eventually she pops out of bed, and they had this little saying, which you'll hear. What kind of day is it, Taylor? And she looked outside and said this, it's a beautiful sunny day. And it was a beautiful sunny day until it got ugly. John Simmond made his daughter breakfast. Her favorite food, waffles and syrup, frozen waffles that she loved. She ate that, and I will tell you right now, that was her last meal. John got into the car with her. They drove around the block. When he looked on 90th, right in front of him, there was a green light, and I can assure you of this. No one, not one of the defendants, is blaming John Simmond for causing this accident. But there is one person who blames John Simmond for this accident. As he enters the intersection, there's a truck that weighs 30,000 pounds, 30,000 pounds coming right towards him. That truck is 10 times heavier than the car in which John and Taylor were seated in. And there was a crash. The only way you'll hear from John that he can describe this crash was like an explosion. And sure enough, that explosion pushed the car to the other side of the street. John Simmond was shaken. He was hurt. But he came to and he looked to his right where his little girl was seated with her seatbelt on. And he saw something, a sight that I can assure you will haunt her for the rest of her life. He saw her bleeding from her nose, bleeding from her mouth, but more importantly, bleeding from her ears. And he reached over immediately, and he put his head right against her chest, and he heard that there was a heartbeat. And he knew then that he would have to get outside, and that's exactly what he did. He pushed open his door, and he took his little daughter out, and he laid her down on the street. And as a court officer, he had learned something he never thought he'd have to do with his daughter, and that was to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation on the one person he never wanted to perform it on. And he started giving his daughter mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, CPR. Well, a police officer responded, and that officer came and started giving little Taylor chest compressions. And he screamed at John, "Keep breathing for her, Daddy. Keep breathing for her." An ambulance came. John was covered in blood at this time. Took them right to the local hospital. a neighbor went running to the house, running to wake up Damaris. And Damaris came out of the house in her pajamas. She went to the scene. John and Taylor were no longer there, but what she saw was a sight she'll never forget. She saw the remnants, she saw the crash, and she saw the blood on the street, and she started panicking. Well, a police officer was kind enough to take her to the hospital. And she went to the hospital, and when she got there, the emergency room, she saw John. And she saw him covered in blood, and then he started talking to her. And it was at that point that she realized, that's not John's blood. That's the blood of their little girl. Within 5 minutes, a doctor by the name of Politis came out, and he spoke the words that no parent would ever want to hear, the words that haunt them both to this day, the words that John cannot get out of his mind. And those words were, "I'm sorry." Dr. Politis said, "Your little girl passed away 5 minutes ago." John Simmond has a special claim in this case, a claim for something known as zone of danger damages. Zone of danger damages because he was right there in that zone of the danger when his daughter was killed. And I will tell you right now, for his emotional suffering, there is one thing that John has blamed himself for. And as I told you, there was only one person who blames John for the accident, and that is John himself. He keeps saying to himself at night, he can deal with the daytime, but he can't deal with night. And he keeps asking himself, why didn't I leave 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later? He has had nightmares, which you'll hear about. I will tell you right now, ladies and gentlemen, we have faulted the driver. No question about that. But we have faulted the city of New York for what they did and for what they didn't do, for their carelessness, for their negligence. We have faulted them for their recklessness because they didn't care. They didn't take the time. They didn't follow through with what they should have done. I will show you what the scene is. This tree, right there, right where I'm pointing, that was taken by the police department. That traffic light that you don't see is the one right behind the tree. 3 times, a man tried to warn the city of New York. No one from the city of New York inspected. The person who signed off on it did not inspect. The person who signed off on it never sent anyone. And if that doesn't evidence a conscious indifference to human life, there is no such thing. And it's for these reasons that at the close of the evidence in this case, I will stand right up here, and I will ask you to find the truck driver negligent and the city of New York both negligent and reckless. And I will ask you to do one other thing, and that is to return the one verdict that you, as jurors, can return, and that is a verdict of 100% justice. Thank you. Now, let me just switch and give you 5 minutes worth of summation so you could see the difference in the form with what we're allowed to do with rhetorical questions on summation versus what we do on the opening statement itself. Rena Gelman, the head of signalization from the city of New York, told you, you heard her words. What is your most important concern? Safety. Can we agree the health of the pedestrians? Yes. The health of the motorists? Yes. The well-being? Yes. Can we agree that when you looked at the work order and signed off on it, you never even checked the foliage? That's true. You never even went to the scene? That's true. You never even looked, did you? No. Would you agree with me that's reckless? Do you remember her response? Do you remember what she said? She took 10 seconds. 10 seconds to answer that, and finally she said, I wouldn't say it's reckless. So I reversed the question. Would you say it was good? No, I wouldn't say that either. Who's kidding who? Of course that conduct is reckless. And then when you add the testimony of Mr. Charles Scott, a former detective who tried so hard, tried 3 different ways to alert the city of New York to do something about this, and no one paid attention. And I told you he did one other thing. He went to the local senator, and he tried there to do something, to get change, to make sure that this wouldn't happen. And in his words, did you hear what he said? He told you, I told them, does someone have to die before you fix this problem? You heard from Justice Schoenfeld himself. And in his words, John had worked there for many years. He knew Taylor Simmond, how she used to come in bubbly, she was happy. He even brought a drawing to court that he held, and John didn't even know that he had that. And sure enough, when I asked, what happened to John, what have you observed? He said, well, I've had a lot of cases. A lot of cases in Supreme New York. Some people lose an arm, some people lose a limb. And his response, John lost his heart. And you heard about the nightmares that John has had, and how he, from this day forward, the day of the accident, he's had a recurring nightmare where his daughter is crying to him, Daddy, help me. But he's unable to help her. So when you think about the suffering, when you think about the emotional harm, is there any doubt that this father has suffered a tremendous loss? Ladies and gentlemen, we need you to do one thing. No question about it, we are asking for a substantial amount of money. But we need you to tell John the one thing that he needs to hear. And the one thing that he needs to hear from you is that he did nothing to cause this accident, and to put the blame squarely where it belongs. Thank you. Judge, why don't I let you take over for a while?